Good evening and welcome to the Journey Home. This particular episode of the Journey Home is a special episode in which we focus on a classic convert. And our convert tonight is John Henry Cardinal Newman, one who you've, I'm sure, heard of and maybe even read some of his books. This is a special program also because it isn't live. It's a taped program for your viewing this evening. And the reason it is because I had a great opportunity that I wanted to take care of. Dr. John Crosby was here at EWTN taping a special series, and having known John and his interest and love for Newman, it was a great opportunity that I didn't want to let slip through my grasp. So we won't be taking any live questions during this program, but in fact we will have phone calls and emails of those who are listening now to the program who will pose them to you later, right. So we have that spontaneity, which I love on this program. Newman is a great model for us of someone who had great courage at a time when being a Catholic was not necessarily the popular thing to be. And so we'll hear a bit of that as we hear about his journey. Dr. Crosby, welcome to the Journey Home.
Thank you, Marcus. It's very good to be here with you.
In fact, it's good to have you here at EWTN.
It's my first time, and I hope it won't be the last.
We'll look forward to your what's the name of your program that you were here taping?
The Personalism of John Paul II, 13-part series.
All right.
On the philosophy of John Paul.
We'll look forward to that soon. Even though the focus of this program is John Henry Cardinal Newman, why don't we begin and ask you for the audience to give a little bit of your own background and how you became interested in Newman.
Well, you know, I'm professor of philosophy at Franciscan University of Steubenville, and Cardinal Newman and I go back a long ways. I was 15 when I first began reading Newman, and it happened like this. I'm a cradle Catholic, but as you know, we cradle Catholics have to make the faith our own, otherwise we'll lose the faith. And when at that adolescent time I was having serious doubts of faith, I turned to Newman, and I found answers in Newman like no other answers that anybody could give me. He really brought me through that time of questioning and doubting, and fully satisfied my mind with the answers he gave me. But I must tell you what most of all nourished me from Newman, and that is the anointed sermons of Newman. In those sermons, I gained for the first time a sense of the living God, the sovereignty, the majesty of God, the fear of God that we creatures have to have in approaching him. And the sermons of Newman communicated that so powerfully to me that it really, as it were, breathed into life that faith that I had from baptism. And so I feel that, in a way, I received the Catholic faith from the sermons of Cardinal Newman.
And not just his Catholic sermons, right? The continuity of all of his sermons.
Most of the published sermons are from the Anglican period, and most of the ones I read that awakened faith in me were from the Anglican period.
Now, it amazes me at age 15 you were reading Newman, though.
Yeah, well, I didn't understand all that I read, but I understood enough to read on and to profit deeply from it.
My guess is that it also helped feed what eventually led to your love for philosophy.
It helped that too.
Because he was one who was deeply imbued with philosophy, and that shaped his theology. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Why don't we give the audience a little synopsis of his early spiritual journey?
All right, Marcus. Let's
When did he live?
Born in 1801 in London. Baptized in the Church of England. And his earliest religious formation was what he later called a kind of Bible Christianity, a religion that really began and ended with the reading of the Bible at home and in church. Now, Newman was an intellectually precocious young man, a deeply sensitive one at the same time, and in his mid-teens, just when I was having my own difficulties, Newman, as he tells us in some of his autobiographical writings, began to have a kind of crisis of faith. And he said that a kind of arrogant intellectualism was taking over and corrupting that faith that he had been born in. And in the fall of 1816, when he was 15 years old, he had a profound religious experience. It wasn't just limited to a moment. It extended over about 4 months throughout the fall and winter of 1816. And in some mysterious way, Newman encountered God, or rather God found Newman. And Newman felt himself somehow profoundly touched by God and called by him and claimed once and for all by God. And he himself says that after that conversion at the age of 15, he was another person. You know, the intellectualism verging on unbelief was completely overcome, and Newman now received the seed of a profound Christian faith. So he goes to Oxford. After high school, he was ordained as a priest in the Church of England at the age of 22. He became the vicar of St. Mary's the Virgin, the parish church in Oxford, in his 20s, and began preaching those inspired sermons that later gave me and so many other people so much. Now, in the late 1820s, he's a young tutor in Oxford. He begins something that is going to be fateful for his later development, a close study of the fathers of the church. We really can't understand Newman if we don't understand he comes from the fathers. And interestingly, most of all, the Greek fathers of the church. Origen, John Chrysostom, and most of all, the great Saint Athanasius. These are the fathers whom Newman studied in the late 20s and who formed him more and more deeply in the faith. Now, the next great date for understanding Newman is 1833. This is the year in which there began in Oxford a great reform movement in the Church of England, which has come down to us in history as the Oxford movement. And the motive of the Oxford movement was the extreme worldliness of religious life in England. The faith was not being handed on faithfully. Religious life lacked all seriousness, all real striving for holiness. And the state was increasingly encroaching upon the church and reducing it to a kind of department of the state. Well, some people in Oxford, with Newman at the center of them, tried to respond to this crisis of the times. And so a great reform movement began, and Newman was the guiding spirit, the dominant leader of the Oxford movement. And Newman tells us in his autobiography that there were 3 great principles of the movement.
It's good to hear some of his writings.
Some say he is the greatest writer of prose in English. He's a great master of the English language, and so it is good to hear him in his own words. He says, the main principle of the Oxford movement is as dear to me now as it ever was. This was written many years later. From the age of 15, that first conversion, dogma has been the fundamental principle of my religion. I know no other religion. I cannot enter into the idea of any other sort of religion. Religion as a mere sentiment is to me a dream and a mockery. So this passion for revealed truth, for faithfully receiving it and faithfully handing it on, that was the cornerstone of the Oxford movement. That's what had been lost in religious life in England, and that's what these Oxford people under Newman wanted to revive. The second great principle, he says, was the idea that Christ founded a visible church and endowed it with sacraments and with bishops who have teaching authority. Because, you see, Newman found that in the Fathers. And the Fathers always, for him, the great norm of authentic Christianity. So the Oxford movement, going back to the Fathers, tried to recover this idea of the church and the sacramental system of the church and the authority of the bishops. The third principle of the Oxford movement was anti-Catholicism. Newman tells us that already as a boy, right after his first conversion, he read Anglican tracts that called the Pope the Antichrist. And Newman says that took hold of his imagination and had a grip on his mind until just a few years before his reception into the church. So throughout the Oxford movement, there was on the one hand this recovery of Catholic things from the patristic period, and yet this anti-Catholic edge. Now, the Oxford movement also, with Newman, brought not just theology and thought, there was an ascetical dimension, that is, a spiritual dimension. Newman saw that there were practices of penance in the patristic church, and he wanted to bring those back. He saw that celibacy was esteemed, and tried to recover something of that. He wanted prayer services during the week, which he introduced into the parish church in Oxford. He began praying the office, sanctifying the hours of the day. So there was definitely, you might say, this ascetical and liturgical dimension to the Oxford movement, as well as the theological dimension. Now, Newman soon finds that this recovery of Catholic substance from the fathers, which he had thought was proper to and the real basis of the Church of England, was not welcome in the Church of England. He was increasingly rejected as a kind of foreign body. And he began to have serious doubts as to whether there was real continuity between the Church of the Fathers and the Church of England in which he was born, in which he was trying to defend. And so he began to look toward Rome and began to realize that the Pope is not the Antichrist, but he still had serious difficulties with becoming Roman Catholic because, again, the Church of the Fathers was for him the great norm. And he saw in the Catholic Church in the 19th century things being taught that were not obvious in the Fathers. There was a veneration of Mary that he couldn't find in his beloved Fathers, a teaching on purgatory that seemed to go much beyond what the Fathers held. And so there seemed to be suspicious additions to the apostolic faith in the Roman Catholic Church. The Church of England, for its part, seemed to not acknowledge the Catholic truth that Newman was reviving, and so he was in a painful, agonizing limbo, increasingly estranged from the church he set out to defend, but not able to take the step into the Catholic Church. Now, we're right here at the threshold of
there
his
we are. Maybe at
conversion.
This point, I'll ask you this, because he had already, this is not true, already he was being respected as a writer and a preacher in England. And what was his influence and maybe reputation at that time in England?
Very great. It was a national reputation. His sermons were read all over the English-speaking world while he was still an Anglican priest. The various theological tracts that were written, Newman's lectures, were read everywhere. It was a kind of, the Church of England was shaken to its foundations by the Oxford movement, and everyone knew that the real intellectual and spiritual force at the center of the Oxford movement was Newman. He was a national figure.
But as you mentioned, there was a little salt and pepper. I mean, part of it was his great influence, and others were not liking the way they were being challenged. I think there was one particular tract, tract 29, if I remember.
Well, there's the famous tract 90.
90, that nailed.
You're referring to the fact that one of the organs of the Oxford movement and its renewal was a series of tracts that Newman started. All of them, trying to, as it were, breathe back into life this apostolic and patristic substance that Newman thought was the basis of the Church of England. And so he comes to tract 90, in which he takes the 39 articles of the Church of England, the main doctrinal formula of the Church of England, and tries to show that these 39 articles are compatible with Catholic truth, and even with the Catholic truth as formulated at the Council of Trent. And it was important for Newman to show that the official creed of his church was indeed fully compatible with all that Catholic truth he was trying to revive. And it was, a great moment of crisis when he saw that Oxford and his bishop in Oxford and the whole Church of England emphatically rejected this Catholic interpretation of the 39 Articles. That convinced Newman. You see, he had this branch theory of the Catholic Church, that the Catholic Church founded by Christ existed in three places: in England, in Rome, and in the Greek churches. And when the Church of England rejected Tract 90 and the Catholic interpretation, he thought he was just trying to reconcile with the 39 Articles that Catholicism common to all three branches. But when he got that violent rejection of Tract 90, he began to think, I'm in a church that has abandoned this apostolic heritage. This is not, as I had thought, a real branch of the church founded by Christ.
So there's a real crisis in his intellectual search for the true church, defining it as the one that he's in. And I'm wondering how I would have responded, would I have been, well, they must all be right and I must be totally all wrong, or the fact that his own understanding of his integrity of what of his studies said, wait a second, the fathers, the fathers are saying this. And wasn't his also drive to find that middle way? Yeah,
that was the idea that the Church of England has a via media, or a middle way, between full-blown Protestantism on the one hand and Roman Catholicism on the other hand. Because he thought that Protestantism he never understood himself as a Protestant. He was an Anglo-Catholic. That was his self-understanding from the beginning. He thought that Protestantism had no link, wanted no link with historical Christianity and the first age of the church, that it was just Bible-centered and didn't even mean to be in continuity with the church of previous ages. So that was not an option. He was in opposition to that understanding of Protestantism from the beginning. But the Roman Catholic Church seemed to be overgrown with idolatry, and so the Church of England was going to have this middle way between the Protestant and the Roman Catholic. But Newman became convinced in the end that the Church of England was also fundamentally Protestant, and that the Via Media therefore
was that the
collapsed.
Springboard then that really opened his heart into the church?
I think it was, this rejection of Tract 90 and other signs that the Church of England was not just Protestant in its popular devotion, as Newman had thought, but at its very core, and that the real understanding of the 39 Articles was really a Protestant understanding. I think that at least estranged Newman once and for all from the Church of England. But we don't have his full story until we see how he got over his difficulties about joining the Catholic Church.
Let's hear that, because it's one thing to have this intellectual struggle, but what is it in that time period of history to make this big jump?
Oh, exactly. Catholics
what is it that
were a despised, marginalized minority in England at this time. And but Newman, as I say, his main difficulty was that the Catholic Church had made suspicious and illegitimate additions to the faith of the Church. And so he thought, he prayed, and by the way, that's very important. When Newman had this difficulty, he didn't just go work in libraries and deal with the difficulty intellectually. He became much more intense and ardent in his religious life. Newman, you read his journals about his penitential practices in Lent between 1840 and 1845, when he was received into the church, and there's a severity of penance and an intensity of prayer life, which was what Newman felt driven to by his perplexity. So he took this as an invitation to go deeper, much deeper in his faith, and grew into a very deep prayer life and a life of mortification that I think is foreign to all of us nowadays. But Newman then formulated this famous theory of doctrinal development. You know, Newman was an enormously creative theologian, and this is perhaps his most creative work. I happen to have it here, his essay on the development of Christian doctrine that he wrote in his last year as an Anglican. And it develops the idea that Christian revelation, he uses this analogy, is like a seed. You see, and just as a seed sprouts and grows, and the final bush, you know, doesn't look necessarily very like the young sapling. So, he says, the Christian revelation, as it was given in the apostolic age, was like a seed sown. And as the church lives through the centuries and encounters different enemies and encounters different civilizations, the seed is challenged to grow, and branches spread, and leaves grow, and we get a vast tree. And yet, it's the same living being that was once a sapling. And so Newman began to think about the Catholic teaching and the apparently new teachings. And he asked, could these perhaps be developments, unfolding of what was there in seed in the patristic period? And Newman came to the conclusion, yes, though there are a lot of popular devotions that I think are excessive, still these Catholic doctrines that first bothered him, especially the veneration shown to the saints and to Our Lady, that especially distressed him and smacked of idolatry to him for a long time. But he eventually came to understand all these specifically Roman Catholic teachings, many of them codified in the Council of Trent, as legitimate developments. So his essay on doctrinal development, where he also developed very careful criteria for distinguishing between true and false developments, led him to the conclusion that the Catholic Church looks like something different from the patristic period. It's really the legitimate development of that Catholic faith that he had received from the Church Fathers. There's a wonderful passage here in this essay where he says, if St. Augustine and St. Ambrose came back to life today, where would they feel at home? He said they would feel at home with St. Bernard, with St. Ignatius, and in the Catholic Church. And so this cleared away his last obstacles. He didn't even finish writing the essay on doctrinal development when he was received into the Catholic Church in 1845.
It's interesting to see the way he's described as beginning to try and prove a middle way, that the Anglican Church was a closer connection to the Fathers, and in fact the end of that study was his own discovery of the development of doctrine as an idea, and then becoming Catholic. Maybe comment on one of my favorite quotes from Newman because of his influence on my own journey. I love that quote in which he says, to become deep in history is to cease to be Protestant.
Right. You know, Marcus, I remember when you quoted that at a church in Steubenville. Before you were received into the church, you came and told us in the congregation about your forthcoming conversion, and you quoted that line of Newman's, and I went back and looked at it again. So he says, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant. That's his idea, that the Protestantism that he had in mind wanted to be simply based on the Bible and get all needed religious truth out of the Bible. It didn't want any sacred tradition to interpret it. It didn't want any bishops to discriminate between true and false. It just wanted the believer alone before God to interpret the Bible. And that was for Newman an ahistorical Christianity. You see, true Christianity is in solidarity with all earlier ages of the church. And the faith we profess has been passed on to us, and therefore we have to, authentic Christianity has this historical dimension. It's rooted in all the earlier ages of the church. And that ahistorical character of Protestantism led to that famous statement, to be deep in history is to cease to be Protestant.
That's a wonderful summary of his journey. You put it very well. Maybe before we take a break, how about a comment on, okay, he's converted. How has his conversion had an impact on England? Changed the trajectory they saw for his future, didn't it?
First of all, it immediately terminated the Oxford movement. The Oxford movement was dead in 1845 when Newman left the Church of England. Secondly, Newman brought many, many converts in 1845 and in subsequent years into the church. Thousands of Englishmen, many Oxford men and women joined Newman in the church. Also, it enormously increased the prestige of this despised Roman Catholic Church in England. That so great a figure as Newman would leave the Church of England for the Catholic Church. That was an enormous boost, you might say, to the Catholic Church, which was just coming out of this time of real persecution in England.
Now, there's a title of a book, a Catholic book, that is actually the quote of a bishop at the time, I think, that points out the fact that Newman wasn't always accepted even in the church because of the controversies of the time. That quote is, to hunt, to shoot, to entertain.
Oh, yeah, right.
Explain that quote.
Right. Now we're over into his Catholic period now. And it's true. Newman, though it was a tremendous gain for the Catholic Church in England, was not always appreciated by Catholics and Catholic bishops in England. And there was in the Catholic Church at that time this extreme clericalism, according to which the serious believers are the clerics and the consecrated people, and the laymen are a kind of horde who, in their religious mediocrity, follow along. And
to hunt, to shoot, to entertain.
And one of Newman's critics, Monsignor, said, "What's the purpose of the laity? Why, it's to hunt, to shoot, and to entertain." And I suppose to support the church financially. And Newman was horrified at that conception. He had an understanding of the layman taken from that patristic period, which was free of all clericalism, and really it was an anticipation of the idea of Vatican II, that all are called to holiness, not just the clerics and the bishops, but every baptized Christian. Newman knew that from his patristic studies, and therefore he brought into the Catholic Church a much loftier notion of the layman and the spiritual possibilities of the layman than were usual. And in that way, he anticipates one of the great teachings of Vatican II, the universal call to holiness, the dignity of the lay vocation. But though the Catholic Church learned to appreciate him in the next century, at his time in the 19th century, he had to suffer very much misunderstanding. In fact, one writing of his on the laity, imagine this, was sent by an English bishop to Rome to be put on the index. It's now venerated as a classic on the theology of the laity. But Newman had to face the possibility as a recent convert of having this writing condemned and put on the index. So it was not an easy life. It was no bed of roses, his life in the Catholic Church.
Emphasizing his own courage, and also emphasizing that he wasn't just a convert and a writer and a speaker 150 years ago, but that what he has to say has much to say to us today in the struggles we have today in being Catholics. We'll take a break now. During the break, you'll see information about the philosophy program at Franciscan University, and then we'll return and take some calls and emails for Dr. Crosby on the life and teaching of Cardinal Newman. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the Journey Home. My guest this evening is Dr. John Crosby of Franciscan University, and our theme is a classic convert, John Henry Cardinal Newman, and Dr. Crosby has done a wonderful job of summarizing his history, his journey into the church, some of the issues that got his attention, and even some of the issues that make Newman someone for us still to listen to here at the end of the 20th century. But we already have some callers and some emails, so why don't we begin right away. Hello, Kathleen. What's your question for us tonight?
Oh, good evening. Could you tell me, please, either one of you, did Cardinal Newman at any time have any philosophical training, either as an Anglican or after his conversion to Catholicism?
Thank you, Kathleen.
Thank you.
Good. Yeah, that's a good question, and of course, as a teacher of philosophy, one that I've often asked in my study of Newman. Now, as an Anglican, he had no real formal course of study in philosophy. I mean, his education, as was usual then, was based on the classics, and so he read very closely the Ethics of Aristotle, for instance, and in that way picked up some philosophy. But I think most of the philosophy that Newman got as an Anglican, he got from the Greek fathers. So that Platonic philosophy, going back to Plato, that the Greek fathers had taken over and tried to Christianize, that philosophy entered deeply into Newman's mind and imagination. So that's, I think, his philosophic formation as an Anglican. Then as a Catholic, you know, he spent a couple of years in Rome right after his reception into the church. And he wanted to study St. Thomas Aquinas, but the study of St. Thomas was in a very dismal condition, and he could only get what he could get by his own private study. So he never took Thomistic philosophy into his thought. It never became a real force in his thought. One does have to say that Newman breathed the air of England, and therefore the philosophy, the empiricist philosophy, that philosophy of the concrete, he very much absorbed that. And he did write toward the end of his life a great philosophical work, The Grammar of Assent, which studies certainty and how we become certain in especially matters of religion. And there you can see that this is an Englishman writing with the English sense for the concrete, the empirical. So Newman certainly, without any formal study, absorbed this spirit of English empiricism.
All right, thank you, Dr. Crosby. Let's take our first email. This comes from Kaki in Utica, New York. Sometimes dissenters want to use Cardinal Newman's ideas on conscience and the sense of the faithful, sensus fidelium, to justify dissent from church teachings. How do you think Newman would answer them?
Oh, well, Newman does have a very rich notion of conscience, and he did say in a famous letter that he wrote to Gladstone, the British Prime Minister, toward the end of his life, that a Catholic absolutely has to follow his conscience. And he even said that if the Pope commands me to do some immoral thing, I have to follow my conscience against the Pope. But Newman makes it clear that conscience speaks to us about concrete matters of duty. You see, as when the Pope would command me to do or omit something. But articles of faith are questions of what has been revealed. You see, that's not a challenge to do some concrete thing. That's a challenge to believe what Christ has entrusted to the church. And so it would be really impossible for Newman, for one's conscience, to entitle one to reject some main article of the faith. And if some fundamental teaching, not some speculation or doubtful question, but some fundamental teaching of the church, and conscience, I couldn't accept it, well, Newman would say, there your task is to leave the church. But your conscience in no way entitles you to remain in the church and reject the faith of the church.
You know, this gets us, I'll take this next email because it tags right onto that. Right. Another controversy of Newman's own development comes from Chris. Love your show. I have been curious as to the controversy over the declaration of papal infallibility in Vatican I and how Cardinal Newman struggled with it in his conversion. Comments on that?
Well, of course, Newman's conversion was in 1845, and the Declaration on Infallibility was in 1870. So there was no struggle of Newman to accept it. But Newman
during his conversion. But
Well, during, the what he called the supremacy of the Pope, he fully accepted at the time of his conversion. Now, this thing of the infallibility of the Pope went a bit beyond what Newman had believed, but he had no difficulty affirming the infallibility of the Pope. But he did oppose the Vatican Council defining the infallibility of the Pope on the grounds that it was unwise, that it wasn't needed, that it would frighten off Protestants who were interested in the Church. He felt that it was being interpreted, this papal infallibility, in an excessive way. There were people who were pushing the declaration of papal infallibility who thought that it covered everything. There was one famous statement by a friend of Newman's who said that he hoped to have a papal bull each morning at breakfast to tell him what to think on the social questions of the day. So there were people who were casting the scope of infallibility much too wide, and Newman thought that the way it was being agitated for was pastorally destructive, and he thought that it needlessly frightened off Protestants. So he thought, not that it wasn't true, but that it was unwise at this moment to define it.
But once it was defined,
once it was defined, in fact, as I mentioned a minute ago, once it was defined, there was a great attack in England, and people said, well, no Englishman can be a loyal subject of Her Majesty. And Gladstone, the Prime Minister, got into the anti-Catholic agitation, and Newman wrote a famous letter to Gladstone in which he explained that the infallibility of the Church in no way precludes the full loyalty of a Catholic subject. So he defended papal infallibility more effectively than anyone else in England after the definition, but before he was opposed on pastoral grounds.
Reminds me a little bit of how one might feel towards the ideas about defining the fifth dogma of Mary.
Yeah,
you know, on the one hand, that Mary as co-redemptrix, mediatrix, and advocate is a long-standing, accepted teaching of the Church. But whether it is prudent to declare it is an issue of debate.
Right, exactly. Those who say it's true, but I don't think it's prudent to declare, are just like Newman in relation to papal infallibility in 1870.
Okay. Let's take our next caller. This is from John. Hello, what's your question for us?
Hi, good evening. I just had a quick question about these Anglican priests that are converting, I hear today also. Are there any similarities to Newman's conversion or this movement of priests back to Rome today as there would be to Newman's time?
Thank you, John.
Well, you know, in most of the stories I hear about Anglican priests becoming Catholic, Newman is a very large figure. You know, our mutual friend, Father Ray Ryland, now at Steubenville, a former Anglican priest, will tell you that he owes much of his way into the Catholic Church to Cardinal Newman. It would be surprising if it were otherwise. Newman was a kind of exemplary convert who opened the way for many another down to our time.
Good. Let's take this email from Greg. I'm not sure about my vocation in life. Though I do not feel called to marriage, I don't necessarily want to become a priest either. I heard from a friend of mine that lay single life is not a real vocation in the eyes of the Church. I also heard that Newman considered a call to single life as a layman. Earlier you mentioned Newman's consideration of the issue of celibacy. Have you any insights as to how Newman resolved his vocational question?
Yeah. Newman, very soon after that early conversion of 1816, felt the inner call to remain single. And he says, I felt it because I sensed that my calling in life in the Church would require me remaining single. And so, though there was no support in the Church of England for a celibate clergyman, Newman had this inner call. And then, of course, as he got into the patristic period, he learned more and more about the deep religious meaning of priestly celibacy. But it was his own personal call almost from the time of his first conversion, but on the basis of an inner call, no support from his church. Now, to the first part of the question, I might say that you may be helped by Newman's esteem for the lay vocation.
Yeah.
He really is a forerunner of the Vatican Council's teaching that all baptized Christians, laymen included, are called to the fullness of holiness and sanctity, that there's not any second-class Christianity for lay people, as commonly was thought and even sometimes taught before the council.
Thank you, John. Let's take our next email. This comes from Bruce. Are there any similarities between the approach that Cardinal Newman took to the faith and that of Pope John Paul II?
Yeah, there's a good question. Similarities. Well, let's see.
Let me ask you this, in your formulation of that, was John Paul at all familiar with Newman, you think, in his own development? Or?
No, I don't think so. I think, as far as I can tell, he greatly esteems Newman. And in fact, just a few years ago, John Paul declared Newman venerable. The whole investigation of Newman's teaching and life led to the conclusion that he did indeed practice the theological virtues to an heroic degree, and therefore the Pope solemnly declared that John Henry Newman is venerable, the first step toward canonization. But I don't think that John Paul was influenced by Newman. I think they're deeply kindred souls, and maybe the point of kinship is this: we say John Paul is the man of the council, the Pope of the council, and Cardinal Newman is one who greatly anticipated Vatican II. So perhaps the two come together through the council.
You had mentioned earlier, in fact I saw this in one of the emails that was flipping through here, and I thought it might be good to, you had mentioned earlier this issue of the dogmatic principle as a key thing for Newman. Maybe explain briefly what he meant by the dogmatic principle.
Right. I'd like to explain that. I'm glad you asked me for more on that. It is so central to Newman's mind and faith. Would it be appropriate to read a few sentences?
Pick a few. Time goes quick on the program, but it's good to hear Newman's words.
Well, he is such a master of English, and it is good to hear him in his own words. This is a passage from that work that really made him a Catholic, the Essay on the Development of Christian Doctrine. And here he contrasts what he calls the dogmatical principle with its opposite, what he usually calls liberalism. And in a way, Newman understands his whole life's work as a witness to the dogmatical principle and as a fight against this theological liberalism.
As people listen to this, they should be listening to how this speaks to today also.
Right, absolutely. Okay. He writes, that there is a truth then, that there is one truth, that religious error is in itself of an immoral nature, that its maintainers, unless involuntarily such, are guilty in maintaining it, that it is to be dreaded, that the search for truth is not the gratification of curiosity, that its attainment has nothing of the excitement of a discovery, that the mind is below truth, not above it, and is bound not to descant upon it, but to venerate it, that truth and falsehood are set before us for the trial of our hearts, that our choice is an awful giving forth of lots on which salvation or rejection is inscribed, that before all things it is necessary to hold the Catholic faith. A quote from the Athanasian Creed. He says, this is the dogmatical principle which has strength. And then its opposite. And here is where you will hear resonances of our contemporary world and feel the relevance of Newman, that truth and falsity in religion are but matter of opinion, that one doctrine is as good as another, that the governor of the world does not intend that we should gain the truth, that there is no truth, that we are not more acceptable to God by believing this than by believing that no one is answerable for his opinions, that they are a matter of necessity or accident, that it is enough if we sincerely hold what we profess, that our merit lies in seeking, not in possessing, that it is a duty to follow what seems to us true without a fear lest it should not be true, that we may take up and lay down opinions at pleasure, that belief belongs to the mere intellect, not to the heart also. This is the principle of philosophies and heresies, which is very weakness itself, which he elsewhere calls liberalism, the anti-dogmatical principle. This drama between the dogmatical principle and its antagonist is somehow the drama of Newman's life.
Comes from his essay on the development of
Christian dogma.
Christian dogma.
Yeah.
You could almost take from that seed of a description of liberalism, which was written about when? About
1845.
Right, the essay on the development of liberalism. You
Right,
can see how it's
exactly.
then the seeds there and how it's developed and so infiltrated our
Exactly.
society
Exactly.
today.
Our
from corner to
society and
corner.
our churches. Exactly, yeah.
Let's take this next caller. Hello, Stephanie. What's your call for us?
Hi, Marcus. I was wondering, in his journey to Catholicism, how did Cardinal Newman resolve his questions about Mary's roles?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you.
Very good. That was a big problem until almost the end. Though I must say first that Newman had a devotion to Mary early on as an Anglican that was unusual in the Church of England. There's an early sermon called The Veneration Ode to Our Lady. This was early in the Oxford movement. So Newman, with his deep Christian sense and his being formed by the fathers, already had early on a veneration for Mary. But he felt that in the Catholic Church it had almost become idolatry. That was his great difficulty. But he, I think, resolved the difficulty in two ways. First of all, he realized that there's a lot of popular devotion to Mary that is not the authentic mind of the Church. He had been reading little pamphlets and tracts expressing this popular devotion, and he went to the sources of Catholic thought and saw that in the official Catholic teaching things were much more carefully balanced and nuanced, and that there was no question of idolatry. But also his theory of doctrinal development helped him. He saw, this gives you a good idea of how that worked. He saw that in the early age of the Church, it would have been very hard to let Mary come into full prominence because the Church was fighting Arianism. There were all these people who said that Christ was a creature. The Church was struggling to maintain the divinity of Christ, that he was no mere creature. And if one had brought in Mary and exalted her highly at that moment, why, that would have confused the whole Christological struggle. So it was somehow understandable that given the need of the Church in the 4th century and the battles that it was in, that Our Lady should have remained somewhat in the background, and that the moment was ripe later for her to come forth and receive her full due in the devotion of the Church. And that's the development of the Church's faith through the ages.
You've mentioned the importance of that particular book, The Development of Doctrine. Maybe with the remaining moments, just a couple of questions. One, if someone wanted to begin with Newman, where would they begin? Because that's not an easy book to read.
No, it's not an easy book. I wouldn't have them begin there. Marcus, they should begin with the sermons. There's the whole soul of Newman in the sermons. There's a beautiful new volume from Ignatius Press that has 8 of the volumes of Anglican sermons in one. Start with that. Anyone can read it. It was preached to a broad congregation there in his parish church in Oxford. The sermons of Newman.
All right.
Begin with them. Read them prayerfully. I assure you, they are sermons unlike any you will have read before.
Thank you. We've got another question, but there's a quick, maybe an email you can answer very quickly from some John. When was Newman made a cardinal?
That came at the end of his life. It was a very gratifying thing because he was subject to so much suspicion as a Catholic, so much misunderstanding. He felt years of deep frustration, and it was difficult. But then at the end of his life, when we had the new Pope, Leo XIII, something changed. Leo had followed the career of Newman and loved Newman, and one of his first acts as Pope was to make Newman cardinal. And so he was invited to Rome in 1879 to receive the red hat, and Newman felt it as a wonderful vindication for his life's work in the Church. And he held a famous speech in Rome then called on the apostasy of liberalism, in which he renewed at the end of his life that protest against liberalism and affirmation of the dogmatical principle.
from what you've read of Newman, what do you think he would say in words of advice to someone who wants to grow closer to Christ?
Yeah.
What would be his advice?
Yeah. Oh, I think his advice, well, it wouldn't just be intellectual. His advice would be, that's the wonderful thing about Newman. He's not just an intellect who has it right, but he's a witness. He's a saintly man. He led a mortified life. He is what he is through what he suffered. So I think Newman would, admonishes us to be more prayerful, be a little more mortified in our way of life, to immerse ourselves in the Scriptures. He lives out of the Scriptures. That's perhaps of interest to all our non-Catholic viewers who love the Bible. You will find Newman revealing the treasures of the Bible to you in a wonderful way. So I think he would send us back to the basic sources of religion and piety.
And maybe also, as you've mentioned, to stand back and examine the relativism, not only of our culture, but which we ourselves have imbued and may be blind to in the ways of our faith, and accepting the authority of the church as he did, as a great model to us for that.
Exactly. This liberalism, you could hear it from the way he describes it, is nothing other than relativism. And so Newman would be very, he would wage war with relativism, whether you call it pluralism nowadays or what other,
it really is
postmodernism. Newman would smell out the relativism, and he would, if he were with us, be a great witness, personally and intellectually, against it.
It's amazing when you sometimes see people using Newman almost as a backing to relativism. It's amazing, because that was far from his position.
Right, exactly.
Maybe as we close, a good way to close this program is, as I asked you earlier, one of the things, maybe you could tell a little bit about it first before you quote it. We got a couple minutes. Is he's also known as a hymn writer, and one particular hymn is well known not just by Catholics but by Christians around the world.
It was a literary man. He wrote 2 novels, and there's a whole volume of beautiful poetry. There's the long poem he wrote as a Catholic, "The Dream of Gerontius," about death and judgment. But as part of the Oxford movement, one of the many things he did was write powerful religious poetry, and the one that has become really loved in the English-speaking world by Protestants and Catholics alike is the hymn "Lead Kindly Light," which we sang, in fact, at the conventual Mass this morning with Mother Angelica.
It was very
at the end.
Appropriate. In fact, as Dr. Crosby reads this, it's a prayer.
It's a prayer. It's a prayer for light. You have to know, this is written in 1833. Newman is on his way back from Italy, where he was visiting, recovering from some sickness and exhaustion. And as he comes back from Italy, this tremendous sense of calling overtakes him. And he is obsessed with this thought, I have a work to do in England, but he's not quite sure what it is. So he prays for light, and hence the poem, "Lead Kindly Light." His ship on the way back to England was becalmed, I think somewhere off the coast of Italy, and in his free time he wrote
So let's listen
this poem
with a prayerful.
"Lead Kindly Light," really a prayer that is a beautiful hymn. "Lead kindly light, lead thou me on. Keep thou my feet. I do not ask to see the distant scene. One step enough for me. I was not ever thus, nor prayed that thou shouldst lead me on. I love to choose and see my way, but now lead thou me on. I love the garish day, and spite of fear, pride ruled my will. Remember not past years. So long thy power has kept me, sure it still will lead me on. O'er moor and fen, or crag and torrent, till the night is gone, and with the morn those angel faces smile, which I have loved long since and lost a while." So
Thank you,
This
Dr.
beautiful
Crosby.
prayer for light.
And a reminder of us to trust the future in the hands of God.
Right. This
Dr.
prayer was answered by the light that led him into the Catholic Church.
Thank you, Dr. Crosby,
Thank you,
so
Marcus.
much
Thank you.
for helping us understand this great convert to the Catholic faith, but first a convert to Jesus Christ.
Right.
What a great witness for that.
Exactly.
Thank you for being
Pleasure
with
to
us.
be with you,
And thank you for
Marcus.
joining us in the journey home. Look forward to seeing you next week. God bless.